Okay, my YouTube friends. Today we're going to take a funny look at the dark side of 80s bodybuilding and actually beyond the 80s, going right up to the current day. It's interesting, like, you'll never find this guy on a muscle memory or something like that where they have it's a database of bodybuilders who's pretty much unknown. Trained for 4 years, placed in a couple of bodybuilding contests and then quit. But here he is, and it's this guy, Samuel Fussell. I read this book way back shortly after it came out in '91. But the gentleman was 6'4" and 170 pounds at the age of 26, which obviously is pretty lean. So he talks about how he gets into bodybuilding, which was kind of a weird thing for him. Here he talks about bodybuilders. You spot them on the streets of the city, in the malls. Sometimes they band together. They strut around, with their elbows high. And he talks about the walk in several spots through the book. And this is kind of an example of it, where guys hold their elbows out as if their lats are too big for them to put their arms down, which really isn't true. And they tend to walk with their legs really wide too. And he talks about the disease, which is commitment to all matters pertaining to iron, not the kind you use to press your clothes, obviously, but the kind you lift. You'll find them in bookstores, hovering by the muscle magazines, which he says invariably are next to the porn. And most guys get started with something like maybe you see an ad in the back of a magazine, like you used to see in the old in the comic books. You'd have Charles Atlas talking about you don't want to get sand kicked in your face, advertising cable sets, this, that, and the other. And for a lot of people, they have a short stint with that, and that's the end of it. But this is not my story, he says. I passed into my mid 20s knowing nothing of the disease until the age of 26. And in fact, his life had been at that point filled with books. Incidentally, he does use some verbiage, which a lot of even I consider myself having a pretty decent vocabulary, and he uses some words that I have no idea what it, never heard it before. You can kind of figure out the meaning though. So anyway, he talks about how he ends up in New York City, uh, and at 6 feet 4, 170, he'd always been gaunt, uh, and then he developed some health problems. So he had rasping lungs, terrible complexion, looked like an outpatient from Bellevue, which in fact he was. This is just a picture of New York City in those days, and probably the kind of neighborhood that he walked through on his way to work every day. And he talks about just the different characters and almost being assaulted by people all the time. He talks about this one guy, Jerry, and he mentions the guy at work. And he's one of these guys with a sandwich board and would, how you doing, Stretch? He'd say, uh, putting his arm around my shoulder. And you run into homeless people. And I used to work in Center City, Philly. So I get that whole idea where, it just felt like you could be assaulted or at least bothered constantly. And in the 80s, New York City was pretty rough. Um, so he talks about how he goes into in 9th September 84, goes in and sees the Education of a Bodybuilder book by Arnold Schwarzenegger, which I read myself as a youngster, and it was inspiring to me. There it is. I do still have the book. And I mean, obviously, it's a pretty inspiring picture if you have any thoughts about being a bodybuilder. And that's where it hit me. He says right there in the Strand, I know instant my prayers were answered. What if I made myself a walking billboard of invulnerability like Arnold? Why couldn't I use muscles as insurance, as certain indemnity amidst the uncertainty of urban strife? Arnold had used iron to his obvious advantage, so why couldn't I? Uh, And he talks about the obvious, you see pictures of guys working out. Arnie was classic. Like, Arnie was always making some face like he was in being tortured when he was working out. Whether it was all legit or not, I don't know. Or it was just a thing he did, but he definitely did that. So then he talks about educating himself about the lifting world. He would say, would buy all kinds of muscle magazines, and of course the book we just mentioned. And these are probably just a few of some of the books that he got, but I think we all tend to do that. I did when I was young and getting started, powerlifting actually more so than bodybuilding. But I think we all kind of get that. And here again, he talks about the walk. Um, So from the night of September 84 to March of 85, I labored 3 times per week in the weight room. Now, in the introduction, he talks about training 6 days a week, double splits, which you ultimately get to. Now, he ends up at this Y in New York, and so they have a universal, and this is kind of what they look like back in the day. I've trained on these, modern gyms typically don't have these, they have separate machines, but you would go around the cycle. So he did that, and he made some gains doing that because he was sincere in his workouts for sure. And then, but he would see the guys across the room that were doing the free weights, and they were throwing some big weights around, and were pretty well developed. So he got into that whole thing, and of course, he started eating a lot more, and when he gets into the 6 days a week routine, he goes up to like 5,000 calories a day. Or, yeah, 5,000 calories a day. So, as he says, 6 months later, he was up to 220. So, that's a significant gain. And at this point, he hasn't done any drugs yet. And I don't think he would lie about it. He's being candid about everything else, very candid about his later drug use. Um, but then, in the course of getting into that all, he learned about doing force reps and negatives and all that kind of stuff. So by July of 86, he was up to 230. So that was a total gain of 60 pounds. And at that point, the dreaded plateau comes. And I think we all know what that's about. You train as hard as you ever did, you're eating well, you're getting a lot of rest, and you just don't seem to be making any gains. And those times come for all of us. So what's the solution? He decides that he's going to go to Southern California, the mecca of bodybuilding. That's a picture of Muscle Beach. So he talks about the move, and he actually ends up going to a gym called which he calls the Shangri-La Fitness Center. Now he changes a lot of names. The book is hilarious, just the way he describes people and things. But so the guy who owned this gym is a guy who he calls Raoul, but it's pretty obviously Doug Brignole, and he actually did a, like a rebuttal to the thing, and he said that when he saw him in the back room, he was walking around and say it's 7%, referring to his own body fat. But it didn't take him long, having arrived in California, hooking up with a couple bodybuilders that trained at that gym. Uh, that one of the guys was actually a steroid dealer, and within 2 days of being in California, he starts the juice, and he does it. He starts on a pretty good dose. He was taking like Anavar a bunch a day, and then taking like a couple shots a week of Deca and Test. Uh, he does absolutely train hard, and he talks about doing squats with this one guy that was much bigger than him, and working up to doing force reps was up to 600, even though he had really only done a legit squat up till then with like 400. Obviously, he was getting a lot of help with that 5 and 600 lift. Interestingly, the guys that he hooks up with, don't really like Doug Brignole's gym, or the fact that it took over the space where Bill Pearl's gym used to be, and that was a much more hardcore gym. So, Sam learns about all the negative side effects about having a sore butt, zits, roid rage, and stuff like that. But the steroids did work. His bench ultimately went from 315 to 405, squat 405 to 545, rose up to 315, and he talks about doing heavier curls and stuff like that. So here is a sequence of when he actually did the 405. He does the whole thing from the initial drive and all the way up. But, a gym lift, and still, he does end up doing 405, at least in the gym. Here he is shown doing squatting like 405, I believe it is here. Now he's wrapped up, but he doesn't have a lifting suit or anything. He's got a belt and wraps. And there he is squatting 500. Now, did he go all the way down? He says that he did. And he actually has very well developed legs, as we'll see when he gets into the bodybuilding competition. But interestingly, the first contest he decides to go in is a bench contest. So, in addition to the anavar and other stuff, he decides to take equipoise. And he talks about the old Inzer Blast shirt, which I used myself back in the 80s. And, that was back in those days. If you got 20 or 30 pounds on your lift out of that, that was about it. That's what I figured it would add about 30 pounds to my lift back in those days. So, as I mentioned, he talks about adding equipoise, which is, as we'll see, a horse drug. But a lot of guys have used that over the years. Um, and there it is, equipoise. And then you see on the bottom it says for intramuscular use in horses only. But he did that at least in training up for this bench press. So he had in mind a longer term goal that, like 6 weeks after the bench contest, he would go into this first bodybuilding meet. And he talks about making weight. Now he had got up to at least close to 260 with all the drugs and training and eating and everything. But of course, when he talked to the guys that had a little more knowledge about powerlifting, they said you don't really you want to look. Uh, 275s would be a good place to be because there's very little competition at 275s, and I know that to be true. The most heated competition is always in like the 198s and the 220s. 242s, it starts to thin out. Anyway, he tries to make 275, but just by being slightly over the 242 limit, doesn't quite make it. He ends up weighing in at 241, so he ends up in the 242s. Um, Long story short, he ends up only making his opener, which was 365. And you could tell, he's a rookie power lifter because, like, he's still in warm ups in between his lifts, which is kind of a big no no, unless it's a really, really long day contest, which it wasn't in this case. So, anyway, he ends up and they give him a trophy because he changed weight classes. It's like the 148 women's first place trophy. Here he is on stage, and he describes himself being a little having water retention here. This is this first meet, this first contest. He's up taking second place overall, first in his class, which really wasn't pretty good for your first contest, but he was disappointed that he didn't win first. Anyway, then it's on like just a week or so later to the Golden Valley Physique contest, which so now he has to ratchet down his diet to even further because they felt like he didn't win first place because he wasn't ripped enough. Here he is on stage, and he does get ripped for this one. And again, he talks about going from to 600 calories a day. Stopped the drugs for that last week. Um, and the whole thing about getting tanned and the posing routine, it just the way he describes everything in the book is hilarious. You really have to read it for yourself. But there he is, again in the relaxed, and he talks about how that's kind of an oxymoron because you're never relaxed on stage. There he is with the double back and biceps. He did have a pretty good physique. I mean, for only 4 years of training from completely nothing, he ends up doing pretty good. There he is. Obviously, he's like it looks like he's about the tallest guy on stage there. Um, and he talks about just the backstage experience. He sees a guy injecting his calf with something that makes it go up like an inch and a half. And again, in order to get properly ripped, he goes down to 600 calories a day, and he talks about walking around the food store, just like having fantasies about all these things he wants to eat and he's going to eat later. But the end result was he placed second in that contest. So not quite what he was hoping for, but really not bad for your second contest ever. Now it's interesting that of course, they went to a big celebration dinner with his friends and he ate pizza and all this stuff. So you wonder, okay, where does he go from here? Well, here he is, and interestingly, he quits bodybuilding, lifting, working out altogether, which is really unusual. A lot of guys will take some time off or, will go on still training later on. Nope, he gives it completely up. You realized that, his whole premise for getting into this was based on some false notions about himself. So that's about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.